Continue to follow breaking news here on Live Now from Fox as Jennifer Crumbley has been found guilty on all charges. A Detroit jury just reaching that verdict, and we showed you and aired that verdict live here on Live Now from Fox. This really is unprecedented because she is the very first parent to be charged in connection to a deadly school shooting. Her son, Ethan Crumbley, now serving a life sentence for shooting and killing 4 classmates at Oxford High School in 2021. We want to bring in James White, who is a trial attorney right here. And we do want to start off with, of course, the biggest, which is the verdict. The jury declaring Jennifer Crumbley guilty on all counts of involuntary manslaughter. And I have to ask, because no one had ever really seen a trial such as this unfold. We now have the verdict. For you, what does this verdict mean? How significant is it?
There's a lot to unpack there, Stephanie. It's significantly going to affect the way that I believe parents address the availability of weapons to their children, because this was not a case of who robbed the bank, who sold the drugs, who stole the car. This was a case about third-party liability. And we see that sort of question posed in lots of different cases, most commonly employment issues, where maybe an employee does something in the course of his employment. Here, we're talking about something much more significant because it's not a civil issue. This was about somebody's liberty, in this case, somebody's mother. So it's been, in my opinion, this has been a legal question since day one, and it was a vague one. We don't have a statute in Michigan that says you can't allow children to have access to weapons. I'm a gun owner, and I'm certainly not taking any political positions, but, I think this is something that should wake up certain legislatures, both nationally and on a state level, because some of these hypotheticals have already being posed. If your children are, having teenage kids are over at the home and they get a hold of unsecured liquor, and one of them decides to go drive through a crowd of people, are the parents responsible? And, I think the hypotheticals could go on and on. So this case is going to be talked about for a long time. I'm not surprised by the verdict. It sounds to me like the jury did spend significant time working through the law, because this, in my opinion, was a legal question and not a factual question. We know who killed these kids.
It's interesting because you said you weren't surprised by the verdict. However, you did mention, of course, could this be a slippery slope when it comes to holding a parent responsible for the actions under their purview? So for you, why was this not a surprise?
Well, I just think that, when we step away from the law momentarily and look at what has gone on in our country over the last, really since Columbine, we're a unique country in the sense that children are no longer safe in their schools. And we've seen this in our community. I don't live far from the Oxford community. We saw this at Michigan State University. And of course, we've seen it all over the country, and people are fed up. And I think at this point in time, this particular prosecutor made a decision to, as opposed to looking the other way at the law, to challenge it and suggest that when you reach a level of gross negligence, you're going to be responsible for the consequences of that negligence. And this community was outraged by this. This was the first mass school shooting that we had in Michigan. With that said, Stephanie, this is where it gets dangerous, right? Because, I think that if you read between the lines, it's easy to say that this jury probably was motivated in large part about what happened in their community. And we never want to look at these situations through a specific lens, right? We want to be fair and across the board. And again, we could use hypotheticals over and over all day long. And the question becomes, if you take the gun out of the picture and put booze in the picture, or, what have you, do we get the same verdict? And I think the answer is probably no. And so I was not surprised by that, because politically, I know how charged this is in our state and our country, for that matter. But this was definitely, this is going to be challenged. This is going to be argued about. for some time to come. And I suspect more prosecutors are going to look carefully at not only school shootings, but children who gain access to weapons or other potentially dangerous materials, and then ultimately lead themselves into the community and cause harm that a parent, it was not foreseeable. And Miss Crumbley, I'm not defending her. She is definitely not Mother of the Year. They made some horrible decisions, but there's a lot of other parents out there that are also, maybe not with their child all the time, keeping track of their child all the time. And I think other prosecutors are going to look at this as an opportunity to hold people accountable.
And let's talk about that. Let's talk about the arguments that both the defense and the prosecution had. Let's start first with the defense. Jennifer Crumbley's attorney, when she was outlining what you said, is that could this set a dangerous precedent for all parents, for all mothers who may not be the best of parents, but yet they shouldn't be held to that standard or punished to that extent. When you took a look at the arguments outlined by the defense, what were your thoughts on that?
So I know Shannon Smith. I've worked against her. I've worked with her. She's a respected attorney here in the state of Michigan. I think she was effective. I know she's been criticized in large part on social media and other platforms for her presentation, but I think her goal was accomplished despite the guilty verdict, and that was to the jury, you could be in this chair, I could be in this chair. Do we want to get to a place where we have to be so responsible for our children that we ourselves become criminally culpable? I think what pushed it over the top was access to the weapon and the lack of accountability once the school put the parents on notice that they had significant concerns. We have mandatory reporting laws here in Michigan and all over the country for reports of sexual abuse. We have mandatory reporting for other forms of behavior amongst juveniles, but really there is nothing to hold teachers and or parents accountable when their child is presenting very troubling behavior. And I think if we're going to get anywhere in this issue legally, it is a broader picture. It's going to have to be to address this issue more specifically, because I think the problem the jury had was the general nature of their instructions. Had there been a rule that says your child cannot have access to a weapon under any circumstances if they're not old enough to do so without your supervision, and then if that ends up in a homicide, you're responsible. That would have been a much easier question for this jury, but they were left to answer a very vague question, and that is, are we responsible for the behavior of third parties, in particular our children? They decided we were.
Do you feel that there will be an appeal to this verdict?
There's no question. She has an absolute right to an appeal. Anytime you're convicted by a jury in the state of Michigan and really anywhere in our country, you have an automatic right to an appeal. And 99% of convicted felons by a jury, that's important to know. If you plead guilty, that right doesn't exist necessarily. But she has an absolute right to an appeal, and there is no question in my mind that she's going to take advantage of that. And this issue and many more are going to be addressed. There was a lot of evidence introduced in this trial that perplexed me, in particular, the evidence of her having an affair, spending time at a horse farm, and then there was this salacious details about her maybe bringing her affair in with other parties. The relevance of that is mind-boggling to me, and I think that, amongst other issues, are going to be addressed by the higher courts.
So let's say she does appeal, which it does seem likely. How would the tactic, the strategy change in terms of the arguments in her defense?
So in an appeal, that's a great question, Stephanie. So sometimes people think in an appeal you can go in and re-argue the facts. That is not how it works. Excuse me. What you do in an appeal is you argue there was a mistake of law, either a mistake by the court, a mistake by the prosecutor, and sometimes a mistake by defense counsel. It's not unusual for defense counsel to allow themselves to be thrown under the bus quote unquote, for the sake of their client. So those will be the issues. Were there mistakes made during the course of the trial that are so um, pervasive that it either requires that there be a new trial or potentially a dismissal altogether? So that's what we're going to hear. Is we're going to hear about whether or not there was wrong decisions made or lack of good decisions made on the part of these attorneys in the court.
One of the questions yesterday that the jurors asked the judge was in terms of Ethan Crumbley. We did not hear him testify during his mother's trial. Do you feel that hurt her or maybe helped her?
Well, we have to presume, I think, is a matter of speculation that Miss Smith made the decision, not because she also could have called Mr. Crumley. She did not do so. And I think we have to presume that she felt there was more risk than reward. But to your point, I think one of the questions the jury probably pondered over was what was his access to the weapon? What was his interaction with his mother? There was certainly an allegation made by the prosecutor, more than an allegation, there was proof presented that she was a non-involved parent. And some of those issues could have been addressed by his testimony. I think over time, not a lot of time, a short period of time, we'll hear responses as to why some of those decisions were made. But clearly the jury wanted to hear, did he have access to the weapon? How much did you tell your parents about your mental health problems? And the husband has a little different situation because, he still had his right against self-incrimination. In other words, he did not have to testify and should not have. But the young man, he's convicted. He's spending the rest of his life in prison. He has filed an appeal regarding his sentence, but his conviction is a done deal. And there was nothing to protect him from being subpoenaed being called into court. So the prosecutor had their reasons for not doing it. The defense had their reasons for not doing it. I think we'll hear more specifics from both sides, but that's a very good question. Clearly one the jury wanted answered.
And let's talk about the prosecution now. The jury swayed by the prosecution's arguments, pronouncing Jennifer Crumbley guilty on all charges. What were your thoughts on how the prosecution presented their case?
So, I think they did a good job. It's a very respectable prosecutor's office. It's one of the more conservative environments in the state of Michigan. People say, whichever way Oakland County goes is the way that presidential race goes. And that's true. It's a very mixed bag of politics. And I thought the prosecutor did a good job of playing into those sympathies and saying, this is not about not being able to have a gun. This is about having a duty to be responsible for your child under certain circumstances where they could harm others. I thought the prosecutor's closing, quite frankly, with all due respect to her, who I do have respect for her, was a little disjointed and a little bit all over the place. But at the end of the day, I think they were successful in establishing that Ms. Crumbley was either grossly negligent or maybe both failed in her duty to care for her child, resulting in the death of 4 individuals.
Now let's talk about the timeline, because this was day 2 in jury deliberations. When it comes to a case such as this, were you surprised at how long or at how brief it took the jury to decide upon a verdict?
I was surprised, Stephanie. I'll tell you why. Because again, this is not a case of factual questions. Oftentimes a jury will spend, 4 or 5 days going through each and every single exhibit. There was a substantial amount of information, but again, there was really no question as to what occurred here. The only question is, did she fail in her responsibilities as a parent to a criminal degree? So the fact that they spent, I believe, more than 10 hours deliberating when we know exactly what happened for the most part did surprise me. And it did make me question what the outcome of the verdict would be.
Let's look ahead to next month, because that is when James Crumbley, the father of Ethan Crumbley, the husband of Jennifer Crumbley, has his own trial when it comes to charges of involuntary manslaughter. When it comes to his trial, will there be, in your predictions, a change in strategy? Because obviously Jennifer Crumbley now found guilty on all counts. How does that change the case laid out for him?
So the parents definitely had different levels of culpability. You know, one parent's at the range, one parent buys the weapon, one parent allegedly is responsible for securing the weapon. So, and that's why their trials were separated. They had antagonistic defenses, is how we describe it. As far as strategy is concerned, if I'm Mr. Crumbley's lawyer, I'm on the phone tomorrow trying to work out the best deal I can for him, because I think the tone has been set as to how this community outlines this behavior or lack of behavior. So Mr. Crumbley will have an opportunity to call his son, and that could be a change in strategy that we might see from his defense counsel. But you know, the stage has been set for him, and you know, if I'm his attorney, I'm taking the risk away and getting him the best deal possible.
When it comes to Jennifer Crumbley, going back to her, obviously she has the right to appeal her case. However, if she loses that appeal, what is she facing in terms of prison time?
So there's a vast range of possibilities. Involuntary manslaughter in the state of Michigan is punishable by up to 15 years in prison. Now, that's a maximum. So to put it in perspective, a first-time drunk driver is exposed to 93 days in jail. And if you ever had a family member or a neighbor or anybody that you know that received a first-time drunk driving, they don't get 93 days in jail. So 15 years is a maximum. There also is discretion on the part of this court to do consecutive sentencing. In my opinion, the grounds are not there for that, but it is theoretically possible. We have guidelines in the state of Michigan, and without going into all of them, there are certain variables the court will look at. As of, I think, about 10 years ago, there was a case out of Washington that basically said the guidelines do not tie the judge down anymore. They're just guidance. So the guidelines here, we have first-time offenders, we have 4 dead people, we certainly have extremely gross negligence, and there's other variables that are going to go into this. So I don't want to predict how long they're going to prison, but I think a prison sentence is guaranteed.
And so for you, you know, let's say you were representing James Crumbley. We're going back to the father. I know that you mentioned if his lawyer probably will be on the phone tomorrow trying to work out the best deal possible. So from what I'm hearing is, in your eyes, it does not seem likely that it might go to trial.
Yeah, I think it's certainly possible. And Stephanie, it swings both ways. I mean, so we have not heard yet from the jury. I suspect we will in some capacity. They were out for 10 hours. And again, this was not a whodidit case, right? This was just a real question of legal responsibility. So the prosecutor has a level of risk here as well, as far as an incentive to come to the table and discuss a resolution. So whether it's tomorrow or next week or next month, I believe his trial is set in March, I expect those conversations to change as opposed to where they were yesterday.
James, this is breaking news. This is very new. All of this is still unfolding. We have yet to hear from the jury. We have yet to hear from both sides. But at this point in time, what else can you shed light on, or anything in particular that surprised you or really stuck out as a defining moment in this case?
Well, the guilty verdict, I mean, it didn't shock me, but I mean, we have a new standard in the state of Michigan now, at least unless the Court of Appeals decides differently. And that is, if you do not secure a firearm and your child has some form of mental health disability, you are responsible for anything that happens as a result of him or her having access to that firearm. So I think you're going to see a lot of people creating locks on their weapons, creating locks on their rooms where they keep their firearms, and more importantly, paying attention to the mental health of their students. I do think, and I think I mentioned this already, this really does set the stage for legislators to take a look at, how can we specifically deal with some of these issues the same way we have with child predators or predators of children. If your child walks into a doctor and says, "I've been abused," there's no question asked. You are criminally responsible if you do not report that act. And I think we're going to see that model expanded into in this environment involving firearms.
James, before we let you go, is there anything else that you would want to share with us when it comes to this breaking news in that the jury has found Jennifer Crumbley guilty on all counts of manslaughter?
Well, first of all, to the victims, my heart goes out to their families. I'm sure this brings some solace. It certainly doesn't bring their children back. And I encourage our community to take leadership when it comes to making changes that Congress is not willing to apparently take on. And that is, how do we protect children and monitor them to the best of our ability when there's a clear mental health issue.
All right, James White, a trial attorney out of Michigan, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your perspective and your expertise.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.